Thank you, everybody. Welcome to Build. I'm Ricky Camilleri. She was the lead prosecutor on the O.J. Simpson trial, portrayed recently by Sarah Paulson. And now you can see Marcia Clark grilling defense attorneys once again in Marcia Clark Investigates on A&E. Let's take a look.
Many, many, many things can go wrong on the path to justice. In every one of these cases, I found something that I hadn't anticipated.
I have sonar images that never got into the right hands.
There was a chunk of deleted Firefox history.
Oh, my.
She said Drew killed Kathleen.
Oh, my God.
I did not kill Kathleen! Yes, you did.
I'm not the prosecutor on these cases, but you deserve to know the truth regardless. So what do you think happened to Stacy Peterson?
You gotta give me a second.
Take all the seconds you want.
Problem is, I know what happened to Stacy.
What is the evidence? Don't spin me. Robert Blake had not been tested for gunshot residue for hours.
Wait a second, time out.
You need to
Time
answer
out.
the question.
No, I'm going to answer your questions, but
You're not. What I've always believed and what's always been really important to me is to know what really happened, because you deserve the truth.
Marcia Clark, everybody. The great Marcia Clark. First things first, I want to get into this as much as possible. Last time I talked to you, it was for the documentary, Made in America, a phenomenal documentary that was made. But I think that was before the People versus O.J. Simpson had come out with Sarah Paulson?
It actually...
Or maybe during or around the same time?
Around the same time. I think the People versus O.J. Simpson was airing.
Yeah.
And then Made in America came out around the end of that series. So it was all around. I mean, there was a swirl that was going on for months.
I don't think I had talked to you about People versus O.J., and I really just have one question about that show for you. Do you feel vindicated in some way? Because that show, in a lot of ways, made you the kind of the heroine of that story. And for a number of years, during the trial and after the trial, I feel like in pop culture, you became like this unnecessary punchline, and that show, in a lot of ways, showed how much of a hard worker you were, what you were up against, and made you kind of the hero of that story.
Shockingly. I didn't expect that. That was a choice that Ryan Murphy made, was to focus on the sexism and the misogyny that was going on at the time that we just took for granted during the 90s. And then, of course, I had the enormous gift of Sarah Paulson playing me, which, I mean, you know, a genius plays you, and that can only help, because I think I've never seen an actress more gifted than she. And we did not collaborate with anybody on the show, so she didn't talk to me about what it was like to be in the middle of that shitstorm, if you will. She just somehow knew how it felt. She figured that out, which is really amazing talent.
Great writing, too, I think.
Great writing, of course, yes. The writing was amazing. And you have Ryan Murphy. I mean, the director. Yeah, it doesn't get any better than that. So they really captured the essence of what it was like. I think it was a vindication for women in general, really. Because what it did, I mean, I was an example, you know, of what was happening back in the 90s that was true for all women. You happened to see me, I was on television, but women were going through this kind of really ugly behavior, being mistreated, being dismissed, being patronized, being undermined in so many ways that we accepted as normal back then. And it's an interesting, to me, sign of progress that during the time I was being interviewed by many reporters because of that series and because of Made in America, most of these, almost all of them, were actually millennials. And men and women across the board were saying, what the fuck, you know? I mean, they were just like, I don't get it. Why were they doing that to you? Why were they acting that way? They were disbelieving. And I think, well, that's progress, because really, that attitude would never have happened in the 90s. In fact, no one remarked on the fact that, you know, the judge would call, say, Mr. Cochran, Mr. Shapiro, and Marcia, you know, and talk about my skirts and talk about my hair on camera, in court, you know, whenever. And today, we look at it and go, that's outrageous. We didn't then. So I think that's a sign of progress.
Yeah, so much of that show's intention felt like was to show us a period of time that we thought was a more progressive time than it actually was, and the sort of insipid institutional nature that racism and sexism both sort of took hold at that time. So let's talk about Marcia Clark Investigates now. Let's get to this. We've got a number of cases. Which was the first case that you really wanted to dive into? That you're going to do this show, and you're like, okay, I need to do this case.
I needed to do them all. I know, when people ask me, what's your favorite case? It's like choosing your favorite child. I really can't do that because they're all fascinating in their own way. So we just chose cases, and it really was a group effort, chose cases that had an intriguing aspect to them. So Csi Anthony, this was shown on TV. People followed the trial. She was acquitted by that jury. Why was she acquitted?
Csi Anthony's really the last, great is the wrong word, but the last sort of like pop culture trial, if I think. The last one that like headlines every day, every media outlet was covering it. I mean, it almost felt like Court TV came back just for the Csi Anthony trial. I don't think we've really had one of those since then, with the exception, I can't think of one, but not like that, not a murder trial.
Jodi Arias came on after that, but I don't think that Jodi Arias captured the national attention the way Csi Anthony did. And I think Csi Anthony was the first really big case of our social media era. I cannot imagine what it would have been like to have social media like Facebook and Twitter and Snapchat, et cetera, during the Simpson case, because they blew up a fax machine in the DA's office. There were so many faxes coming. Who faxes anymore? I mean, I haven't faxed in years. I don't know about you guys, but, if I can't email it, I don't know how to do it. So things have changed very rapidly, but Csi Anthony came along with all of that. And I believe that the defense really capitalized on it. They used social media to gauge the public opinion, and it's really funny. I have a podcast associated with the First 48 show, and in it, the first podcast is about Csi Anthony, and I talked to a jury consultant as well as a psychoanalyst. I had the psychoanalyst talk about Csi Anthony and her kind of mentality and what her doctors, the defense had hired doctors to examine her. Those doctors were deposed, and I had my expert look at those depositions and talk about her state of mind, but I also had a jury consultant who worked pro bono on the case, and he conducted a focus group before the trial. And that focus group, shockingly, foretold exactly where the jury was going to go. They didn't like George Anthony. They focused on him as a suspicious character. They didn't trust the science, and then the defense capitalized on all of that in the trial and came out the same way. So I was really interested in why. I mean, this is a woman who lied about where her child was for 30 days until she was busted, basically, by her mother, was partying, wet t-shirt contests, getting tattoos. I mean, this is not the behavior of a woman who's concerned about the disappearance of her child. Told conflicting stories about it. Zanny, the nanny, supposedly kidnapped the baby, and then later on in trial, they would claim that the baby actually drowned, and then she was afraid of being charged with neglect, and so dumped the body instead of calling 911. And to me, none of the stories really seemed to hold water. So reinvestigating the case, getting into the facts and getting into the details of the case and talking to the witnesses myself, I was able to go into it with actually, in spite of what I thought, I set it aside and go in with an open mind. Maybe the jury got it right, because even though you might think somebody did it, the truth is our system of justice requires proof beyond a reasonable doubt. And if you don't see proof beyond a reasonable doubt, then you must acquit. And I thought, okay, maybe the jury got it right. And this is where I think having training as a lawyer, it does help you to be unbiased in that way and hold your mind open and think about, re-examine everything. And so we got into it and discovered new evidence that I believe would have changed the verdict.
Wow. Can you talk, or do you want to save the new evidence for when the show airs, or can you talk about what the new evidence is?
That's a good question. Let me ask my publicist. Can I talk about it? I can talk about it. So here's what happened. This did not come out until after the trial. Jose Baez wrote a book about the case, and in that book, he said he had hired a computer expert to look at the family desktop computer. So realize this was the early 2000s, and people didn't all have laptops and iPads and stuff, and so there was a family desktop computer. And the defense expert had found that in one of the browsers, there was a search history that he was able to recover that was a search for foolproof suffocation. And that search was conducted shortly before Caylee Anthony, the child, disappeared. Now, at that time, the defense expert said, well, but the time stamp for that search indicates it was conducted when George Anthony, the father, was at home. So the defense theory was that George Anthony was thinking about committing suicide because he was so upset about what had happened to his granddaughter, because their theory was that he helped to dispose of the body. So one of the key things to determine was, is that timing correct? We found somebody through web sleuths, a computer expert, as well as a lawyer, who came forward to say, actually, the program that was used to detect when that foolproof suffocation search was done was incorrect. It was inaccurate. Actually, the search was done an hour earlier, or an hour later, pardon me. An hour later, which was when George Anthony was proven to be at work. And the only person at home at the time that search was conducted was Csi Anthony. So she had to conduct that search for foolproof suffocation. Then, and one of the methods you found on that search was to put duct tape or put a cellophane bag over someone's mouth after they'd been drugged, which is the prosecution theory about how Caylee had died. There was evidence of chloroform. There was evidence that duct tape had been placed over her nose and mouth. All of that would have suffocated her to death. They presented that evidence. More than that, we also found Caylee was picked up by the police after her mother called 911 and said that she had smelled what smelled like a dead body in the trunk of Casey's car. The police come to talk to Caylee. They take her out to all the addresses where she claimed the nanny might be with the baby, because she was claiming the baby was kidnapped. And they went to each address, and each one of them turned out to be bunk. One was a retirement home, one was a model unit, one was vacant. It was clearly all lies.
Just driving around this one,
This
that
one,
one, that one.
Correct, exactly right. And then they bring Caylee back home. They leave her alone in the house, trying to figure out what charges they can bring. And while she was alone in the house, someone deleted the history that contained the search for foolproof suffocation. And the only person who would think to do that is the person who conducted the search. To me, that added to all the rest of the evidence, probably would have changed the jury's mind about what happened.
But you say so much of what, and this is now moving into not necessarily hypothetical, but you extrapolating what happened with that jury to what happens with a lot of juries, which is this idea that they operate off their gut a lot of the time, it sounds like. That it almost didn't matter what the evidence was presented, that they had created a personal preference for the plaintiff versus the defense. How often do you find that happens?
All the time. Not in the sense that juries get it wrong.
I mean, so much of that, sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but so much of that, and I hate to go back to this, but so much, your famous trial, the OJ trial, so much of that was the OJ trial. You got painted a certain way, OJ got painted a certain way. A lot of that was sexism, a lot of that was race, but a lot of that was also sort of gut reactions, right, to how people felt about the scenario.
Not exactly.
Fair enough. I am not an attorney. I am a celebrity interviewer.
No, not exactly. And actually, in the wake of the Csi Anthony verdict, I wrote an article for the Daily Beast in which I said the Csi Anthony verdict is much less explicable to me than the Simpson verdict. The Simpson verdict was very understandable to me. 400 years of social injustice, tensions between LAPD and the minority community that had been mounting and mounting and exploded just a year and a half, 2 years before the trial, in the Rodney King trial verdict, and then riots. City burned. It was the most violent riots in that century. That there would be a great deal of tension, animosity, and suspicion of LAPD at that time was a given. And it had been in all our cases for 10 years. Downtown, in downtown trial courts. So
not to mention you had the Mark Warner, or was it Mark Warner? What was his name? The LAPD detective who, on tape, all that stuff. Yeah.
Furman. MF, as I called him. Anyway.
Why?
Those were his initials. Anyway, but that I understood. We saw the verdict coming. There was no surprise there. That I understood, actually. Csi Anthony, I did not understand. And I can get why you might like George Anthony more or less, or but I do think that they saw this pretty little white girl sitting at the counsel table who the defense got to sit up straight and act correct, because in the beginning she did not. And she became more and more familiar to them as time went by. She looked vulnerable. She looked sweet. They didn't want to believe. I think there were a lot of, these are not conscious feelings, but I do believe the subconscious impact of the image of her versus George Anthony had a great deal to do with how they ultimately felt about all of the parties. And then, of course, the prosecution couldn't say for sure, the ME could not say for sure exactly how Caylee died, but the circumstantial evidence surrounding it, the suspiciousness of all of the the evidence surrounding it, I think, after I re-examined it all, made it pretty clear to me that she was killed. Now, could the jury have voted for something less than murder? Yes. The prosecution gave them every chance. They gave her, they filed charges of child neglect, child abuse, manslaughter, second degree. The jury had a panoply of choices. That they chose none of them is really striking to me.
Where do you think that comes from?
Like I said, I think there was a lot of unconscious bias going on. You know, I think that all played into it. And then sometimes you do just get a runaway jury. But I also would like to study the impact of celebrity. You know, I do think that one of the things that happens, two things are in play in this jury at the very least. One is called the Csi Effect. And people have blamed the Simpson case for this because we had so much evidence. There was so much forensic evidence. There was DNA. We now take that for granted. Back then, people thought it was some kind of a mysterious thing, which I knew. I had been working with it for years, and I knew it wasn't. But people now expect it. They expect DNA. They expect hair analysis. They expect fingerprints. They expect everything. And you didn't have that necessarily in the Casey Anthony case. In addition, you have the identification with the defendant who is in the courtroom with them for day after day after day. And then you get this feeling of familiarity, and then you get this sense of, I don't want to believe that she could do this. And there is, I think, also this thing about women defendants. There is still a bias about we don't want to believe a woman is capable of a violent crime. It challenges our unconscious beliefs about women, particularly.
Mother as well.
That's it. Particularly a mother with a child, and all of their pictures looked so loving. It was hard for anyone to believe she could behave that way with her child on camera and then do something so heinous. So there's all of these kind of psychological factors that I think came into play.
So my next question is, how do you get started investigating one of these cases that's already been investigated? And I'll say we've probably talked a lot about the Casey Anthony case, so if you want to use an example, let's try a different case that's in the show. But how do you get started investigating a case that's already been investigated? Where do you look first?
So I like to start with the most important witnesses and the investigating officer that led the investigation, because that's where you'll find the biggest, most rich source of information. But and usually we start with records. There's a computer search that goes on. We Google, we investigate, we read all the articles, and cull from that what seems to be the most important aspects, and then plumb from there. And usually the investigating officer is a good start. Lawyers are a good start. But we want to ultimately get to the actual witnesses, the ones who were involved, who knew the defendant, who knew the victim, who was eyewitnesses, that kind of thing. And then finally, if the case has already gone to trial, I like to try and find jurors. And we did get a juror to talk to us in the Robert Blake case, because again, that was an acquittal. That did not make it to air, but I will talk about it in my podcast. And the podcast, which is Marcia Clark Investigates, will air before every episode. And in it, we'll talk about aspects of the case that we don't show on the television show, because even though these are 2-hour episodes, each one's like a feature, yeah, there's still material. There's so much to talk about. There's still material we couldn't get to in the TV show.
Yeah. What made you go after the Robert Blake case?
Again, intriguing case, because it seemed from the outside, and I covered that case for Entertainment Tonight as a reporter, and I was in the courtroom, and I thought, well, it seems pretty clear. You have these stuntmen who used to work with Robert Blake. He went to them and asked them basically to kill his wife. There was clearly no love lost between he and Bonny Bakley, his wife, whom he married because basically she extorted him into marrying her because she got pregnant by him, and he wanted to keep access to the child, and he had concerns about her fitness as a mother, justifiably so, because she was someone who was bilking men via mail and sending out and pornographic pictures to send her money. She had this whole business on the side. She did quite well with it. Took pictures of herself and sent them.
Surprising woman, yeah.
She was an entrepreneur. But and so he wanted to maintain contact, but he really was not a fan of the mother. So there was motive there to want her out of the picture so he could raise the baby himself. And these two stuntmen testified to the manner in which he tried to hire them. They turned him down. But we wanted to look into that, because I also heard, though, that these stuntmen had histories of drug abuse, and they had their own problems with the law, albeit more minor scrapes with the law. And there was no real physical evidence. So there was reason, I thought, for the jury to acquit. Reason I thought for the jury to say, gee, I can see a reasonable doubt. It was a tough case. But ultimately, there were a few things that made me say, I think the jury might have gotten this one wrong. One of the main things that I think was never brought out in the public eye very much is the fact that a few feet from the story was, Robert Blake claimed he took Bonny Bakley out to dinner at Vitello's, where he went all the time. And that after they finished dinner, they went back to the car. He realized he'd left his gun at the restaurant because he carried a gun with him. And when he went back to the restaurant, while he was in there, that's when she got shot. That he came back to the car, found her already shot, and then ran to a neighbor's house and called the police. However, there was a dumpster, a big dumpster, because there was construction going on the house next to the car, where the car was parked. And in that dumpster, they found the murder weapon. And the murder weapon was this antique World War II P-32. The serial number was scraped off. It had oil on it. It had a round in the chamber, and 2 rounds had already been fired. She was shot with 2 rounds. That was the murder weapon. I asked myself, if there was a hitman or some other person other than Robert Blake,
Oh, they have an antique World War II gun.
I'll buy that. I'm going to give them that. Okay. That can happen. They exist in nature. And as a matter of fact, the fact that the serial number was scraped off is not a big deal, because a lot of GIs during World War II took guns back with them and knew they weren't supposed to, so they scratched off the serial numbers, right? So I thought, okay, I'll give you that. But what third party would leave the gun at the crime scene? If you're going to shoot someone, if another person had reason to want to kill Bonny Bakley and followed them there to the restaurant, number one, that person would have to know that Robert Blake was going to be gone at all, let alone long enough to shoot her and get away. And how could you predict that? If you're following them, the fact that Robert Blake leaves the car, why would you even follow them to Vitello's? That's a weird thing for a third party to do. You don't have any reason to believe you're going to get Bonny Bakley alone. But even if that's true, why do you leave the gun there? You take the gun with you and you run, because nobody's going to find you. You can dot out very quickly from that particular neighborhood. So
I've always been told, leave the gun, take the cannoli, though. I thought that was the way. I mean, Corleone leaves the gun in the restaurant as well. But why do people, they don't leave guns at murder scenes anymore?
It actually wasn't in a restaurant. That's why he left the gun. It was out in a deserted field.
Well, that murder was.
Yeah.
When he kills the cop and the leader of the other, or he kills the cop, it's in the restaurant before he goes to Italy.
That's right.
Yeah.
So when he takes the cannoli and leaves the gun, it's actually a safer thing to do. But that's The Godfather. I mean, we're talking about, but think about it logically. Does it make any sense to you that somebody would leave the gun there in the dumpster to be found?
We're also talking about like 1935, hypothetically, versus 1996, 95?
Right,
Yeah.
when you know that there are fingerprints to be found, DNA to be found, hair, perhaps fiber. I mean, there's ways in which you can analyze that gun and find all kinds of stuff. Now, as it happened, the gun was in a dumpster covered with dirt. When it got dumped out, I mean, there was a lot of evidence that was lost, but the bottom line is, logically speaking, who else would have to dump the gun so close to the body? Only someone who had to remain at the crime scene.
Right. Who had to be there when the cops got there and say, oh, look who I found.
Yeah.
That's so strange that he got off then, because that sounds so poorly planned.
Yeah.
Not that I've ever planned a murder, but I'm just saying, if I were, I don't think that would be the way. Did they go after him for premeditated, or was it really? Do you think it would have been? Yeah. It wouldn't have been premeditated. They may have gotten him if they had gone after him for like.
They did both.
Oh, they did.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's really funny to me how often the press reports, oh, well, the prosecution charged first-degree murder, and if they hadn't done that, the jury might have convicted. It's so rare as to be almost never happen that the prosecution only charges first-degree murder. And even if they only charge it, the judge instructs the jury on lessers, like say, second degree and often manslaughter, too. So the jury, generally speaking, does have options, and they did in this case, too.
Do you miss prosecuting?
Not a bit.
Really?
No. I mean, for a while I did, for the first few years, and then it was kind of like, you know what, it is what it is. I was supposed to, I guess that's the way it was supposed to be, moving on, and I'm supposed to do other things in my life, but I have to tell you in this show, it's kind of like the best of both worlds, because my favorite part of being a prosecutor was investigating. I loved being out in the field with the detectives and talking to witnesses and finding evidence and putting it all together, and so this show lets me do that and tell you about it. And I mean, I really do believe in everybody getting the truth. I would like to actually get into wrongful convictions. If I had my druthers, the show would go all over the place that way. People who were wrongfully convicted, people who were wrongfully acquitted, rightfully acquitted, that kind of thing. I want to be able to talk about the whole range of things.
Are there any wrongful conviction cases in the back of your head that you want to get into?
There's one in my mind right now that I just read about in The Atlantic, and now his name escapes me. I'm sorry.
Oh, that's okay. I mean, it's a tough question to put you on the spot with.
No, but it was literally heartbreaking. He was convicted and sentenced to life for the robbery murder of someone, and as I read the article, and it seemed a very balanced article, it didn't seem like, they're hiding the evidence of guilt. The evidence of guilt was ridiculous. Unbelievable to me. And eyewitness testimony is always a tough sell. And this was eyewitness testimony that claimed they saw him leaving the scene from like 100 feet away at night. And I don't know who can really detect, identify somebody accurately under those conditions. And then you had a jailhouse snitch who turned out, of course, biggest liar in the world, and later said, I lied.
It's a regular occurrence, right? Like a reliance upon jailhouse snitches is
I don't know about reliance on them. And I don't think it's a regular occurrence. It does happen. And it should never be allowed to be presented unless there's physical evidence to corroborate what they're saying. I mean, it does happen that people talk in jail.
Yeah, but so often, I mean, the problem with the jailhouse snitch is that they have a strong motive.
Oh, yeah.
To snitch on somebody.
Absolutely, which is why, at least in California, there's a jury instruction that says you must view this testimony with caution, and not accept it unless it's corroborated by other evidence. And that's why this doesn't happen much in California. I don't know about other states, but in this case happened in 1975. And even though it seems to me so clear that he's innocent, he's still in jail and hoping for parole, and they keep turning down his parole request, and every bit of it is unfair. And if I get to, I hope I get to, in this show, expose his case. Because sometimes, I mean, how many people read The Atlantic, I don't know, but I know that television shows get an awfully big reach, and they can put pressure on people to do the right thing, and I'd like to see him released.
And podcasts do too, recently.
Yeah, podcasts, yes. Yes, and boy, believe me, I'm going to talk about him on the podcast because it's painful. It's so painful to see somebody locked up unfairly.
Let's get some questions from our audience. Who has a question? Right here.
We're going to take our first question from an online viewer. Melissa would like to know, as a former prosecutor, can you give us any insight about what you see going on with the Russia investigation?
It's really hard for me to give you an opinion on that, other than clearly there are Russians who've been indicted now. What, 13 of them? Yeah. And now they're imposing sanctions on 12.
This is what happened in the UK, right?
Yeah.
Oh, no. That's new news. Yeah, that was this morning. Sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, they're imposing sanctions on 12 here, and then there's what happened in the UK. So, I mean, I think that Mueller has a boatload of information we don't have. I don't know if we're ever going to get it because the laws that govern what a special counsel can release are very different than independent counsel, and they can sit on it. And unless the Democrats retake the House and the Senate, they'll squash this investigation. But I believe he's amassing a great deal of information, and the indictments of 13 tell me that a whole lot is going on with that.
What are the indictments of Manafort, Gates, Papadopoulos, and it's Manafort, Gates, Papadopoulos. There might be one or two more that what do those tell you?
There was one more at least, but yes. I mean,
or let me specify that a little bit more. What do you think those indictments say about our president's potential connection, not in terms of collusion with Russians, but potential connection to like the global criminal underworld that like Russia is so closely affiliated with, and the oligarchy is so closely affiliated with?
Yeah, the fear I'm having that based on what I'm reading now, is more the involvement of the Trump company into with the oligarchs who are investing dirty money in their condos and their real estate holdings, and the connection there. That and obstruction of justice seem to me to be the real issue. Whether or not there's collusion, it might be tough to prove. I don't know. The meeting in Seychelles looks suspicious, to say the least. Could it be more nefarious? I mean, what more could you do other than sitting in some cave in some dark in some like James Bond movie or something. You know what I mean? It feels like Dr. No. So I don't, and that was with the UAE. So I'm not, there is that to look into for sure. But what seems to me and makes me worry is that because he doesn't release his tax returns, I'm even more concerned about where the money comes from that comes invested into his properties. And more we're seeing that the money that's invested in these properties is way overpriced. I mean, they're paying enormous sums for these condos, that much more than any normal person would pay. And it's obviously
A laundering outfit.
yes.
What have you thought of, we'll get off this in a second, but I'm just kind of curious now, what have you thought of Mueller's, how Mueller has handled himself in the entire investigation and how he has brought the indictments?
So this is a beautifully classic prosecutor, you know. Stay quiet, do your job. I mean, look, he's not like a normal prosecutor. He's not in a public courtroom. He has to maintain silence and you know, and conduct his investigation privately with as little fanfare as possible, and he is. He's behaving appropriately and doing what he should, and keeping it, from what I can see, keeping it very clean.
Next question. Do you have a microphone? Who does? Oh, right here.
I ask this question of my students a lot. How does, like you did, get beyond the defining moment in their life and their career, like after the OJ case, and even during, when you, as you mentioned, you were picked apart for your dresses, your legs, your hairstyle, your love life, and it didn't stop. It was a daily occurrence, and I know some of the people involved in the case vanished or just disappeared from the public eye after a while. So how did you get past that moment to where you are now?
So during the trial, when all that was going on, I was focused on the case. What was upsetting to me was not all that stuff that I heard about and dismissed. I was in there fighting for justice against, I mean, my biggest obstacle in that courtroom was the judge, who never enforced the rules of evidence, who abandoned his own judicial ethics, who, you know, allowed the courtroom to turn into a circus. And going into court every day and knowing the wrong thing would happen every day, that was the painful thing for me. After the fact, and after the trial, I had 2 little kids to take care of. I had to get on with my life. I had to take care of them. I had to earn a living. I had to, you know.
You became a writer. It's so inspiring.
Yeah,
it's so inspiring when someone like is the main, it's like the lead prosecutor in the O.J. Simpson trial or something that humongous. It's like, I'm gonna go be a writer.
Yeah.
It's so wonderful.
But I always loved writing, and I loved crime fiction from the time I was like 4. It was really, I was a very weird kid. And so I got into writing crime novels and scripts. I got into writing for television. And now I have a pilot being shot at ABC, yeah, called The Fix. And so we're doing it right now, and I'm hopeful. We just we have a wonderful cast. We have
How involved are you in that process? Or are you kind of like, I wrote the script, there's a whole development thing, and you guys get directors and you do your thing?
no.
You're involved.
Oh yeah.
Good for you.
Oh yeah. Well, good and bad. I mean,
Yeah, of course.
Get up at 5 in the morning and you're working until midnight. But no, I co-wrote the script with Liz Craft and Sarah Fain, who are awesome writers. They worked on The Shield, if you call that. And they're wonderful people, and I love them so much. And so we wrote that together, and now we're in the process of shooting, and we did everything together, budget, casting, everything. Really cool. We have Robin Tunney, and we have Adewale, and we have Adam Rayner, who was on Tyrant. We have Scott Cohen. We have, gosh, this is like, I'm so tired that I'm like,
No, that's amazing. That's
I'm losing words, I'm losing names, I'm losing things. But, so we're in the thick of it right now. I think this is day 5 of shooting that I'm missing as we sit here.
If it gets picked up, are you going to be in the writer's room and working on the show, or are you going to kind of leave that and go to Investigates?
I'm gonna do both.
That's wild.
Yeah.
That's a lot of work.
Yeah, no, it's a lot of work, but these are all passion projects. These are all things that I just love to do, so, you know, you find the time, you sleep a little less.
I think we have time for one more. Right here.
I was wondering, in your experience, how often do cases result in a reasonable doubt, or like get passed off from reasonable doubt? Because that seems like sort of a broad term, like reasonable could mean different things to different people.
You know, you're right. The standard reasonable doubt is kind of elastic and can be stretched here and there, but in my experience, and I've been a defense attorney as long as I've been a prosecutor, because I'm also handling criminal appeals for the indigent. When you're convicted of a felony and you can't afford a lawyer to represent you, you're entitled to a direct appeal, one direct appeal to the Court of Appeals. The court appoints a lawyer to represent you, and I've done that work for 10 years. And in my experience now handling thousands of cases, actually acquittals are pretty rare. Juries may find somebody guilty of less than what they were charged with, but by and large, they do convict, and by and large, they get it right. Once in a while, they get it wrong. Csi Anthony, I think they got it wrong. This man I'm talking about, whose name I have now forgotten, who got convicted, they got it wrong. They got it wrong in Trayvon Martin, in my opinion. Although I'd like to reinvestigate that one and get into it, and I'm hoping I will.
Well, that one's so hard because the law that was created, you have to kind of believe as well that the law itself is kind of wrong.
And that's not true. As a matter of fact, everybody got all excited about the stand your ground law. A lot of states have stand your ground, so does California. It still means, what it means is that your life, you are not required to basically die rather than defend yourself. It does not mean that you can target a teenager walking across your path and decide you're going to shoot him. I'm sorry. That case actually got me very upset.
Well, yeah, he's on the phone with 911, and they say, do not leave the car, do not approach him. He's like, I'm going to get him.
So
It's
clear.
like, yeah.
Right?
It's so obvious that the guy was looking for trouble.
He was looking for trouble, and then in the years afterwards.
He's a nightmare.
Right.
He's like a nightmare human being.
Yes. So, you know, how they went there, that's why I want to see, but that's my point. That's about this show. Because if I can reinvestigate and show people what I saw, because that was another case I followed very closely, I will go in with an open mind, I promise. I will go in and say, hey, maybe the jury got it right, I want to be fair. Because, like I said, the standard is beyond a reasonable doubt, and if even though you think he might be guilty, that's not good enough. That's not our standard. And I want to go back in and talk to everybody myself. But I will say that having watched it very carefully and read everything I could get my hands on, and I did a lot of commentary on it, I believe they got it very wrong, and I want to understand why. But in any case, whatever I find, I want to show you. I want everybody to see what the truth of that case is.
Marcia Clark. Marcia Clark Investigates. The first 48 is on A&E. When is it on? When can people see it?
March 29th, 8 o'clock.
March 29th is the premiere. And what case is that?
Csi Anthony.
That's Csi
Csi Anthony. Sorry, forgot about the mic.
Oh,
wait,
that's all right.
You wanted to ask a question?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Can I let
What
you?
is it?
Thank you. I was going to say, what put you on your quest to justice, and do you remember your first case?
I do remember my first case. So what put me on the quest for justice is hard for me to even remember. You know, it's kind of like, because I feel like I was born like that. Yeah, you know, I mean, I just was always thinking about that kind of thing, really from the time I was a little kid. I was reading books that I shouldn't have been reading when I was really little. So it was always there. My first case was a prostitution case. I was a defense attorney, and I was defending the woman, and we both cried when she got convicted. The judge was a sweetheart, gave her probation, you know, so no bad thing happened ultimately, except she got a conviction, which I didn't think was right. And I think that only sharpened my feeling of, you know, I want to go for justice for everybody. And so when I say justice for all, I mean for all. I mean,
What was she convicted
you know,
of?
prostitution.
Oh, okay.
You know, it was a misdemeanor. By now it's been probably wiped off her record, but it was painful, you know, and somehow I have to say, the losses almost make you feel, I mean, sometimes, you know, you lose a case and you should lose. On the defense side especially, you know, you know that your client did it, and really it's a question of what did he or she do? And was he or she convicted of the right thing? And did he or she get a fair sentence? Sometimes, a lot of times it comes down to that. That's about justice too, but on those occasions when the wrong thing happens, for, you know, whether it's convict or acquit, that keeps you going, me going even more so. Winston Churchill said, success is not permanent, failure is not fatal, to continue on is the point, is what matters.
Don't give up, basically.
That's
You
it.
know, I was going to end this interview, but I have more questions. Do I have to end this right now? Are we okay? Because you're so passionate, and I want to talk to you more about about justice. Just a couple more questions, if you don't mind. Oftentimes, what people talk about right now, or one of the big conversations, is plea deals and the way that those that are poor can't afford proper defense attorneys, and DAs or not DAs, but public defenders are overloaded with work. They plea down all of these kids who, or all of these people who really should go to trial because they could potentially win. What do you see as possible solutions for our justice system in appropriately defending everybody that needs a good defense?
First, let me stand up for public defenders.
Yeah, overloaded with work. I am not trying to...
No. In my opinion, in my experience, and it's, I've been on both sides of the lawsuits, they're some of the best lawyers you see in criminal courtrooms. They know, they just know the ins and outs. They are really quality lawyers. Can they be overloaded? They can. But I will tell you that as a couple things, two things about that. Number one thing, they get, generally speaking, preferential treatment from the prosecutors and the judges because they're in court every day. We know them, we trust them, and they get the better deals, generally speaking. Secondly, one of the reasons I left private practice, defense work, is because I wanted the power to be the good guy, to do the right thing. I had been up against a lot of prosecutors. Some were good, some were fair, some were not. And I thought, I want to be the good guy. I want to be the guy that the defense can come to and know that they're going to get all the discovery. They're going to get everything I've got. I'm never going to hold back. I'm going to offer them the best deal I can possibly give them and be fair in every possible way. As a prosecutor, you have the power to make justice happen more than you do as a defense attorney, which is a more reactive position. Very important position, but more reactive. So I think that obviously public defenders need to be better funded. And I think you need to expand their services. I think in general, law enforcement needs to think more in terms of community policing, which is a great idea, rehabilitation instead of mere punishment. What I see going on in the prisons is hair-raising. So many of these guys, I mean, my clients, they're schlemiels. They're not bad people. They're not Hannibal Lecters. That's 1%. 99% are impulse challenge, judgment challenge, and they come from simply rough backgrounds. They were not raised on Sesame Street. Their options were very limited. Teach them. A lot of them want to know how to do things.
Reform.
Yes. Help them learn skills, learn how to take care of themselves, learn how to do jobs, and then hire them. I am very proud to say I had a client who was convicted of possession of a gun and a few rocks of cocaine. And back when we had a more draconian version of the 3 strikes law, and he was sentenced to 66 years to life. He was going to die in prison. We got a change in the law, Arizona versus Gant, that came at the very end of his appeal, and I ran to the computer and banged out an emergency help, a supplemental brief, stop the presses. The process went on for quite a while. I was on the phone with him almost every day. Dion became like my phone buddy. And he was the best client. He'd go, I'd say, look, I don't want to blow smoke, but I'm gonna tell you this is a shot where I'm gonna take for you. Please have patience. And endless patience. He'd laugh and he'd joke with me and ask me if I was still rocking the new haircut. We got him out. He's out. He started a business. He's doing well. He's a member of the community. This is an example of so many, He's exceptional because he did have skills and he was a smart guy and he had the stuff. A lot more of them would do this, given the opportunity, and that's what I'd like to see. I'd like to see our system of justice readjust the alignment. Let's talk about helping these people become the functioning members of society that 99% of them want to be.
Marcia Clark, everybody. Let's hear it.